Submarines are designed to spend the majority of their useful lives underwater. That's the whole reason they were invented. When they're not underwater, the next most likely place you'll find them is in a harbor or base. Not all submarines end up where you expect them to, though. Some end up being abandoned in the most unlikely of situations, and we're going to take a closer look at a few of those strange abandoned submarines right now. We shouldn't always applaud the work of urban explorers, who often break the law in pursuit of their photographs and videos. But we can't help but admire the photos that the Dutch urban explorer Bob Thyssen obtained of the Portuguese submarine Delphim S-166 in July 2019. The submarine has been moored at a naval base in Lisbon after retiring from active service in 2005. During their visit, Bob and his friends were amazed to find that the submarine was still full of equipment like gauges, sirens, and logbooks, along with personal items like board games, including chess, draughts, and Mastermind. The Delphim S-166 served in the Portuguese Navy from 1969 to 2005 and belongs to the Albacora class. Only 4 vessels of this class were ever built. Approval was given for the submarine to be turned into a museum in 2006, but that was more than 15 years ago, and there's still no sign of the plan being put into action. It's a shame that it's been left to rot for such a long time, but at least it's in a protected location, and it's still in reasonably good condition. When Julius H. Kroll built an underwater exploration vessel in New York, USA in 1866, he didn't know what to call it. He eventually landed on the name Submarine Explorer, which sounds very generic today, but wasn't at the time. His creation was about as primitive as you can imagine a submarine being, but it worked in a rudimentary kind of way. Kroll's submarine was acquired by a business that wanted to harvest oysters and pearls from Panama's Pearl Islands and carried on in that role for 3 years. During those 3 years, 2 problems became evident. The first was that the Pearl Islands didn't contain as many pearls as it was hoped they might. The second was that the submarine caused decompression sickness, and the problem couldn't be fixed. Word quickly spread that everyone who boarded the submarine became ill, and so finding people to operate the submarine became even harder than finding pearls. Because of a combination of the 2 factors, the submarine was abandoned on a beach in the Pearl Islands in 1869 and has been rusting away there ever since. The U-352 is a Type VIIC German U-boat, 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was built in 1940 in Flensburg as part of the ill-fated German war effort. The U-boat had a fairly uneventful military career until May 1942, when it became the first German U-boat to be sunk by the United States Coast Guard. The vessel was close to the American East Coast during the time and was sunk by the USCGC Icarus as part of the Battle of the Atlantic. The wreck of the U-352 can be found just south of Cape Hatteras in calm, warm Gulf Stream water, which makes it one of the most popular wreck sites for the area's many divers. The vessel is mostly in one piece and has developed an entire marine ecosystem. The hull of the U-boat is encrusted with algae and has been noted to support sea anemones and a variety of corals. So many amberjack and red barbier baitfish swim around the wreck that it's sometimes difficult to obtain clear photographs of it. Experts say that the wreck is in a stable condition and might survive for several centuries, barring accidents. The biggest diesel submarine in the Russian Navy ever built is known as B-307, but she's no longer under the sea. In fact, she's been dry for quite a long time, standing somewhat improbably on grassland in the city of Tolyatti. The massive undersea vessel was built during the late 1970s and began her military service in 1980. She'd clearly have posed a threat to any enemy submarine she came into contact with, but her military service was largely uneventful. B-307 wandered the seas between the Mediterranean and the Barents for 21 years, without sustaining so much as a scratch in battle, and was retired from the Northern Fleet in 2001. At that point, she was immediately bought by a Togliatti-based museum which borrowed 6 military tractors to drag its new acquisition onto this patch of grass, and then decided it would be easier to open the museum there than try to move it any further. The Somme-class submarine is now designated as the Togliatti Museum of Technology, but hasn't been open for several years. She'll never sail again, but it would be nice if the museum could be reopened, so she still had a purpose of some kind to serve. The submarine known as the USS Ling hasn't enjoyed much luck during its existence. The 312-foot-long vessel was built for the Second World War, but the war was almost over by the time it was finished. That left it with no purpose to serve other than to become a very expensive military training vessel at Brooklyn Navy Yard. And even in that guise, it only lasted until 1972. The unwanted submarine was then taken to the New Jersey Naval Museum and opened up as a floating museum for the public to poke around in. The aging vessel was already in a fairly shabby state when Hurricane Sandy struck the area in 2012, damaging the Ling extensively and also wedging it firmly in the mud of the Hackensack River. The damage to the boat resulted in the closure of the museum, which is yet to reopen. The submarine isn't on city property because it's in the river. The US Navy has washed its hands of it. That leaves the museum, which doesn't have the resources to restore it or even to move it. It's so low in the water that people can walk all the way up to it when the tide is out, which brings problems of its own. It would be a shame if the Ling was left there to rot, but that's the kind of life it's had so far. While the life of the USS Ling has mostly been full of disappointments, the Russian nuclear submarine K-84 has lived a remarkable and varied existence. The Delphin-class vessel was commissioned into the Soviet Navy in December 1985 and continued to serve the Russian Navy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. She was still in service in 1999 when she was renamed the Ekaterinburg. By 2011, she was showing her age and had been sent to dry dock in Murmansk for a refit. That's where, on December 29th, she caught fire so badly that emergency services workers had to partially sink the submarine in order to put the fire out. It's thought that sparks from welding being performed on the boat's hull set fire to wooden scaffolding, which in turn ignited the hull's rubber coating. Most people expected that to be the end of the Ekaterinburg's life, but she underwent 3 years of repairs and returned to active service in December 2014. Her nuclear weapons were finally removed for the final time in 2020 as the vessel was prepared for decommissioning. The decommissioning process is scheduled to be completed by mid-2022, so the process ought to be almost complete. The submarine U-475 was a Soviet Navy submarine and was also built with the Cold War in mind, but it ended up in a very unlikely location. The submarine, also known by the nickname Black Widow, is currently moored close to Strood on the River Medway in England. The Black Widow is a Soviet Project 641 class submarine and is one of 74 that are known to have been completed by the Soviet Navy between 1957 and 1983. This particular vessel was launched in December 1966 and served for almost 30 years before being decommissioned in 1993. It spent most of those years as part of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, but was primarily used as a training vessel towards the end of its operational life. The Russian Navy sold the submarine to a private buyer in England, who turned it into a museum ship, originally moored close to the Thames Barrier. It would later be moved to Folkestone in 1998, and then moved again to its current location in 2004. As you can see from these images, the Black Widow is now in a state of severe dilapidation and can no longer function as a museum. It's supposed to be scheduled for restoration work, but judging by the state of the vessel, it may already be too late for that. Most submarines are built by the military and for the military, but there are notable exceptions. Most of those exceptions are built for perfectly legal reasons, but some aren't. This next one definitely wasn't. It's a semi-submersible boat that was recovered from Timbiqui, Colombia in February 2011. The vessel was impounded by soldiers on suspicion that it was being used by drug traffickers. Based on a later assessment of the homemade-looking boat, it would have been capable of making it to its presumed destination of Mexico. In fact, authorities think it had already made that journey several times in the past. With a cargo capacity of 8 tons, the implications of it being able to shift that quantity of narcotics are obvious. This isn't the only so-called narco-sub that authorities in South America have encountered. Another one was found in Ecuador the year before this Colombian example, and many more have been intercepted since. The problem can be traced back to 2000, when police found a half-built submarine hidden in a warehouse in the Cambodian capital of Bogota. Even a self-built sub like this would cost about $2 million, but the costs are presumably worth it to traffickers. The INS Kusura S-20 is both a submarine and a source of national pride in India. When she was launched in February 1969, she was only the 4th submarine India had ever built. The vessel is a Kalvari-class submarine, which is a variant of the Soviet Union's Foxtrot class. The Kusura served in the Indian Navy for over 30 years, most notably during the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, where she's said to have played a crucial role in patrol missions. After the war, she was mostly used for friendly naval exercises with other nations, and was sent to visit other countries as a goodwill vessel. The Kusura was finally retired in February 2001, at which point Indian Chief Minister N. Chandrababu Naidu dedicated the vessel to the nation and announced she would be preserved as a museum. The first members of the general public to be allowed to visit the Kusura climbed aboard in August 2002. She's the only vessel in the Indian Navy's entire fleet to retain dressing ship status after retirement, which is a sign of how much she means to the Navy and also the people of India. The HMAS Otama is a submarine with a secret. The Oberon-class submarine spent its entire military career with the Royal Australian Navy, but was actually built in Scotland. She was the last vessel of her class ever to be built, and was launched in December 1975. The purpose she served in the Navy was once top secret, so much so that the crews of other Royal Australian Navy vessels referred to her as the Mystery Boat. We now know that she was fitted with intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment and spent most of her time monitoring Soviet Pacific Fleet vessels and Chinese Navy vessels. After being decommissioned in 2000, she was sold to a private firm a year later with a plan to be turned into a museum vessel. However, her owners struggled to get planning permission to have her permanently moored anywhere. They eventually tried to sell the submarine on eBay in 2008, which made headlines around the world, but a buyer couldn't be found. She's been in limbo ever since, with the most recent plan to turn her into a museum rejected by authorities in 2013. German U-boats were a major problem for Allied vessels during the Second World War, but they were almost as big a problem during the First. A lot of people don't know that U-boats already existed at the time of the First World War, but here's the proof. This is UB-122, which was handed over to the British at the end of the war under the terms of the German surrender. Britain and its allies were already well aware of the threat posed by the ships and wanted them out of German hands. UB-122 was to be towed to a military base, but its tow rope snapped while it was being dragged up the River Medway in Kent. It's been stuck there in the notorious mudflats ever since. It proved to be impossible to free the submarine from the mudflats, but the mud at least did a good job of preserving it. When the tide goes out, the U-boat is visible in its entirety. Even after all this time, the ship is still in one piece. The passing of time has still had an effect, though. A survey was carried out in 2013 to determine whether it would be possible to extract the ship and move it to a museum, but the conclusion reached was that it was in too fragile a state. We've seen a few Russian submarines in this video, and we'll see 2 more before we go. Just off the coast of Murmansk in the Barents Sea lies the wreck of the Russian nuclear submarine K-159. The wreck is still believed to be dangerous and poses an existential threat to the fisheries on the surface as well as the whales, polar bears, haddock, and red king crab that call the region home. It's one of many nuclear submarine wrecks in the region, another of which is the K-27. The vessel was known as the Golden Fish because of its eye-watering cost, but was scuttled in 1982 after a series of accidents, including a reactor rupture that exposed 9 sailors to a fatal dose of radiation. Safety measures were implemented when the vessel was scuttled, but it will become dangerous again by 2032 at the latest unless new measures and protections are introduced. The story of the K-159 is different. It sank with no warning in 2003 and went to the bottom of the ocean carrying more than 1,700 pounds of spent uranium fuel. The wreck has been described as a slow-motion Chernobyl on the seabed.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!